A blessed day, everyone. I am Jamela, and welcome again to Book and I. It is a program that will look on different books and their insights, which will help us to grow more in faith and practice. The basic insights and practices of gospel renewal are right for two reasons. It fits our time, and it centers on the heart in a biblical way. If the last chapter tells us about the whys of gospel renewal, what is the appropriate question that will be answered by this chapter? What does the gospel actually do that changes the people in the congregation? Well, the essence of gospel renewal will answer that. Revival is necessary because religion is so different from the gospel but is such an effective counterfeit. As Martin Luther said, the default mode of the human heart is work righteousness. When the gospel is no longer pondered, we will naturally drift off to working for our salvation or maybe earning God's approval. This is religiosity, or in other words, moralism. To start off this chapter, let us first examine the three ways of responding to God. Three ways of responding to God. We typically identify two ways of responding to God. That is totally rejecting His command, living for our pleasure, which is irreligion, and to follow Him and do His will. Although this is somewhat true, we tend to not recognize another way of rejecting God. That is embracing and obeying His command to earn our way to heaven. And the problem with this second way of rejecting God is the deception that we are doing God's will even though we're not. The gospel has nothing to do with our developing our righteousness that we give to God so that He owes us. In fact, it is God who gives us and develops our righteousness through Jesus Christ. And again, just as a recap, as the author says, there are not just two ways to respond to God, but three: irreligion, religion, and the gospel. We must continue to ponder on the gospel and put our faith only in what Jesus Christ has done as the basis of our salvation, because even we, as Christians, we might revert back to religion. Preaching the third way for everyone. If you are trying to communicate the gospel message, you must not only help listeners to distinguish between obeying God and disobeying Him, to make out a clear distinction between obeying God as a means of earning our way to heaven and obeying God out of gratitude for Him for an accomplished salvation is also a must. Both moralism and antinomianism were dangerous ways of responding to God. None of this is greater than the other because both were just the same thing. And there is only one way to cure these two. That is preaching the third way of approaching God, the gospel. A deep grasp of the gospel is the antidote both for a heart that thinks freedom is being outside of God's law and heart that leads toward the law for salvation. Gospel behavior change. A proper orientation of gospel to someone's life will not only bend his attitude to obey God's law, but will reshape his heart so that he will obey God out of love for Him, which has an eternal effect rather than a temporal one. The problem with moralism is what is instilled in the people's life is to obey God out of fear of punishment or out of pride. This may harness the attitude of man for a short period of time, but like a metal bent out of its original shape, it may soon snap out and break, leaving faith altogether. How the Bible moves us toward change. Paul, in his epistles, whenever he writes to the churches to give to the poor, to be faithful to their spouses, to say no to ungodliness, and so on, he didn't address them in a way of steering their emotion, their pride, or out of fear of punishment, but bringing them back to the grace that the church received in Jesus Christ. Paul is saying that if you want true change, let the gospel teach you. As summarized by the author, the gospel, if it's truly believed, help us out of the extreme neediness that is natural to the human heart. Without the power of the Spirit, our hearts don't really believe in God's delight and grace, so they operate in their default mode. Through the gospel, we come to base our identity not on what we have achieved, but on what has been achieved for us in Christ. Faith restructures our motivation, self-understanding, our identity, and view of the world. It changes our hearts. Importance of idolatry. One of the most important and biblical ways to help people come to see how they fail to believe the gospel is by instructing them about the nature of idolatry. As Martin Luther said, Anything we look to more than we look to Christ for a sense of acceptability, significance, joy, hope, and security is by definition our God. And these not only pertain on the bad things we treasure, but even to the good things we turn ultimate in our lives for a sense of significance and joy. As the author summarizes, so if the root of every sin is idolatry, and idolatry is failure to look to Jesus for our salvation and justification, then the root of every sin is a failure to believe the gospel message that Jesus and Jesus alone is our justification, righteousness, and redemption. To end this chapter, let us go back to the words of the author that expresses the essence, foundation, and help that we need to live a godly life. What then is the essence of behavior change? What will help us lead godly lives? The solution is not simply to force or scarce ourselves into doing the right thing, but to apply the gospel to our heart's idol, which are always an alternate form of self-salvation apart from Jesus. And this is the chapter that we have today. Hope you learned something and may the peace of Christ be with us all. Again, this is Book and I.